Okay, in chapter 19, we're going to take a look at psychosocial development as it occurs in emerging adulthood. So during emerging adulthood, a strong sense of identity is usually achieved. So as we looked at in earlier chapters when we were looking at adolescence, the search for identity was an important part of that process of development. So in emerging adulthood, usually that starts to come to fruition. Although most adults, they will continue to seek, to determine, who they are, and sometimes seek to not only define themselves, but maybe even redefine, maybe, change things or something like that. But generally speaking, in, early, like late teens to early 20s and everything, usually a strong sense of identity begins to emerge. Now, in regard to ethnic identity, that they mention here that Erickson, he referred to what's called political and religious identities, and that they are really important in our modern multi-ethnic world. And they mentioned though that for these groups, there's it's especially difficult for two groups here in the United States, the groups known as Dreamers, who are unauthorized U.S. immigrants who meet, 5 certain criteria. Although they don't, they're not automatically given citizenship when they meet that criteria. And then second group that's can be kind of difficult to establish a strong identity here in the United States is what they call adoptees, and that's just international adoptees, raised in the United States, but still they may be, from another culture, that makes it a little difficult to integrate into U.S. culture. So, emerging adults, it says it's really important that they establish, their ethnic and political identity. And they mention, a statistic here, half of emerging adults have non-European ancestors and many have mixed heritage. So definitely knowing one's personal roots, facilitates acceptance of roots of others. Now, obviously, when it comes to identity, there can be political identity, and there can also be gender identity. Feel free to pause and consider, the differences and the types of definitions or something that you might want to use to gain further insight into this. Okay, and we're going to take a look at vocational identity. And so that's interesting because vocational identity, they say it's an important part of growing up, and they mention a couple of things. Many go to college, as a way to kind of prepare for the job that they would like to eventually get in life, the career that they'd like to establish. And so definitely, take a look at these. And I did put a note at the bottom here that's in red. And I mentioned here, I just want to remind you that, your vocational identity, your job, whatever, is not just about finding a job or a specific job that you like. That's not all it's about. It's also about establishing who you want to be, who you are, and then actually becoming that person. So they just mentioned here, that, I just want to remind you that sometimes that can be a difficult thing. It can be a very long process. And sometimes it's not unusual for people that have been in a certain vocation for maybe even a couple decades, or even even 1 decade, they may just say, look, this isn't who I am. I'm going to make a change. I'm going to redefine myself, reinvent myself. And so just keep that in mind. Now, here's just something that I thought you may find interesting. So there are different, I guess one could say, traits. Here, right here in this diagram right here, you may be stronger in, say, realistic type thinking, or you may be more socially oriented or artistic or something. And what has been what this is kind of a no-brainer for most people, but it mentions here that, workers, they tend to have healthier hearts and minds if their job fits their personal preferences. And I'm sure, a lot of you listening and looking at this, you're probably well acquainted with that idea. Okay, so now we're going to start taking a look at personality and in emerging adulthood. And so one thing that's interesting about that is, that they've determined that, there's a, rising sense of self-esteem in this growth period. And it says continuity and improvement in attitudes of young adults occur. So continuity is an important term there. That means, establishing a kind of a rhythm, and that things, you start finding what works and keep to that. That's continuity. And finally, the ability to set their own goals, make their own friends, and work toward whatever goals they seek strengthens their self-esteem. Okay, so carrying on with this discussion about personality, so they say, well, worrisome children, that they may tend to grow up, when they do grow up, that doesn't mean that they're automatically going to exhibit that type of behavior or that type of psychology when they become grown. So feel free to stop this and take a look at all the examples and everything that they list here. But one thing I do want to make you aware of is at the bottom here it mentions increasing self-esteem may occur as young adults are able to set their own goals, make their own friends, and work toward whatever goals they seek. Now, I put a little note down here at the bottom, and I said, where I suggested that maybe you look up the term humanism, and that's actually a branch of psychology that you may find interesting. So personality and emerging adulthood, we're going to take continue a little bit more into this, and so they use the term plasticity is neurological and cultural. Remember, plasticity means a certain, being malleable, being able to be flexible and change and everything. So neurological, that means, definitely our brains are capable of constant change and adaptation and everything. And so is our culture. Our sense of culture. I did put in red down here something important to focus on, and this is an interesting point that are actually genetics. They do not determine your behavior. They don't really determine your behavior, but they influence how susceptible you are to your environmental forces. And so they call that plasticity genes. They put that in parentheses there. And that just refers to the fact that, if I may just elaborate a little further on that, what that refers to is the fact that we may have, certain genetic inheritances, but that does not mean that they're going to, demonstrate in our behavior. That actually the environment, things that occur in our environments actually is what can trigger the Okay, sorry for the interruption there. My internet cut out. But what I was before we got cut off here, what I was referring to is the fact that our genetic inheritance does not determine our behavior. It's how environmental forces may influence how our genes express. So we're continuing on with personality in emerging adulthood, and so plasticity is okay. Once again, I apologize. Having problems with internet here, and that's making us repeat things. So moving on. My apologies here. So anyway, so definitely in regard to close family and friends, our social interactions, we're going to take a look at intimacy versus isolation, and so Erickson, in his sixth psychosocial stage, he emphasized that humans are social creatures, and that social isolation can actually be harmful at every age and in every culture. So intimacy, that progresses from attraction to close connection to ongoing commitment. Last but not least, marriage and parenthood, as adults are learning, are only two of several ways, several instances of intimacy. Okay, so please stop the video here and just take a look at these three these topics right here. Moving on. So sometimes, it's been found that, adults, especially, parents, that was what you're referring to, can provide too much or too little non-financial support. So they mention, a couple of instances here. Please stop the video and read these. And they refer to, some terms such as helicopter parenting and things like that. Now, in regard to friendship, throughout life, friends, help defend and help protect one another against stress, and they help to provide joy in each other's lives. And so men, they tend to share their activities and interests and talk about external matters, but don't, tend to not talk about things like failure, personal, internal things or emotional problems. And they tend to demand less of their friends so that they, as a result, they kind of tend to have more of them, whereas females tend to share secrets, they reveal their weaknesses and problems and expect sympathy. They tend to be more intimate and emotional. And I just put a note here that, this is all generalization, and these were just findings according to a meta-analysis of 37 studies. Okay, so male-female friendships, so gender differences are cultural, not biological. So what do they mean by that? So remember the differences, between men and women, those are usually defined according to cultural norms. For instance, in certain cultures, men should be the breadwinners. They should be the ones that go out and earn the money and support the family, while the wife, stays home and takes care of the children, things like that. Those are cultural norms. So gender differences, definitely what makes men different from women or whatever. Those are culturally defined. Okay, so we'll take a look at love during emerging adulthood, and so this, Robert Sternberg here, you do not have to memorize that name, but this researcher described three different aspects of love, which are passion, intimacy, and commitment. So please stop the video here and read those. Take notes if you need to, and just seek to understand and think about each one and what you think about each one. And so they mention, that our Western ideals of love, those usually include passion, intimacy, and commitment. That sometimes that can be difficult to achieve all three of those, that passion, might fade over time, but yet intimacy may grow and stabilize, while commitment can deepen. So they just, mention that is just to kind of keep that in mind. So another thing too, is the, cohabitation during emerging adulthood is pretty common for persons who are unrelated to each other to live together. Okay, so they mention a couple of things here, variations, with culture and cohort. They talk about hookups and hookup culture, monogamy and polygamy. Feel free to examine these at more in depth, according to your interest level there. Okay, so what they've said is, there's an emerging adult pattern in the U.S. That people are starting to get married a little later than they have traditionally. And feel free to stop and take a little more time to look at and think about each of these. Moving on. Love and marriage and relationships, so changes in patterns of relationship between love and marriage. So they were mentioned that previously, love, and marriage and everything, love marriages usually occur only after young people are financially and emotionally independent. That's what they found is now. But previously, that was not the case. So they just wanted you to see that the changes in the pattern, what that has led to now. And cohabitation is now pretty much the norm in the United States. So definitely community, culture, and demographic differences, they do matter. And I did put this in bold letters down here. And there's an important thing to keep in mind is education tends to increase the chance of marriage and marital childbearing. So what kinds of things tend to help relationships succeed? And they mention a couple of things, like maturity, good communication, financial security, and the end of addiction or illness. So feel free to stop and think about each of those. And moving on here. Moving on. So when it comes to in good communication, learning to listen, there's a term here, demand/withdraw interaction. And that's a situation in romantic relationships wherein one person, they want to address an issue and the other refuses. So that is a type of withdrawal. Whereas, women tend to be more demanding and more men withdrawing. So that can lead, the inability to understand love gestures may be a contributing factor to that dynamic. Okay, feel free to pause the video here and look at this if you seek a little more in-depth understanding. And same with this here. This is just, some various causes of domestic violence. We've discussed a lot of these in previous chapters. And so that concludes this discussion.